Shavua Tov. I'm Dr. Rona Novick, and I can't think of a better topic as we approach Tisha B'Av than empathy. The question of can and should we walk in another's shoes from both a Torah and a psychological perspective. I come to you not as a Torah scholar, but as a clinical psychologist and the dean of the Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, and someone who's particularly interested in the role that empathy plays in our lives and the lives of our children and our students. Why should we be addressing this question now? Well, as we're in the middle of a pandemic and the question becomes about should you wear a mask? Are you obligated to wear a mask? There are questions of empathy and when do we prioritize the needs and the feelings of others over our own? And if that weren't enough, the racial divide in the country is providing us with an opportunity to listen and reconsider others' experiences. But I think we'll discuss empathy today because of its centrality in Torah and in Jewish thought and life. And we'll also develop, I hope, together in our limited time, a psychological understanding that can not only help us appreciate our behavior and that of others, but also think about how we might change and shift our behavior when we so desire. Let's start with a definition. Carl Rogers, famous psychologist, wrote that empathy is the accurate understanding of the other person's world as seen from the inside. And the dictionary definition is that empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of either the past or present without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. In other words, feeling another's pain, walking in another's shoes without actually having to do that. There is a distinction between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is experiencing, actually feeling what another feels, where sympathy is understanding and feeling sorry for that other person, but not necessarily feeling with them. It's feeling for them in sympathy. We're going to start with some Torah views, and really the most basic statement comes from the Psukim in Shmot, and there are various references in Shmot to our status as a ger, as a stranger in Mitzrayim. And because of that, because Gerim Hayitam Ba'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in Eretz Mitzrayim, you cannot be an oppressor. You know the heart of a stranger, and you must always think about what it is to be a stranger. Then many of the Torah perspectives on empathy derive from this and other psukim, both in Shmot and in our liturgy, that focus on our experience as the downtrodden, as slaves, as the oppressed. Rav Soloveitchik writes so beautifully in Kol Dodi Dofek, the awareness of shared historical experience leads to the experience of shared suffering. A feeling of empathy is a basic fact in the consciousness of shared Jewish fate. The suffering of one segment of the nation is the lot of the entire community. The scattered and separated people mourns and is consoled together. Prayer, the cry, and the consolation were formulated in the plural. Supplications that emerge from the depths of travail are not confined to the suffering and affliction of the groaning individual. They encompass the needs of the entire community. When there is a sick person in one's house, one prays not only for that person, but for all the sick of Klal Yisrael. When one enters the house of a mourner to comfort him, what do we say? Our words of condolence are Avlei Tzion, all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. The slightest disturbance in the state of an individual or a sector of the people should trouble all segments of the nation. It is, Rav Soloveitchik goes on to say, it is forbidden and it is impossible for the individual to isolate himself from his fellow and not participate in his suffering. I've given you other examples here, also from Shmot, where we not only, we begin with Gerim Hayitam, you were strangers, but we move on to how do you treat the poor? How do you treat a neighbor? How do you treat someone who borrows something from you? And in his really beautiful article in Reflections on Empathy, Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb talks about the particular element of the pasuk that I highlighted here, et ha'ani imach. Literally, this could mean, according to Rashi, the person with you, the poor person within you. It is not that we look outward and say, oh, look at that poor person, that's sympathy. We think about how each of us carry within us the ger and the poor person. Rashi, as Dr. Weinreb suggests, urges us to walk in the moccasins of the impoverished. And he goes on to talk about the example of Moshe Rabbeinu, who is a duguma, an example of how when the community is suffering, you cannot say to yourself, I'll go to my own home, I'll eat and drink, and I'll be in peace. You have to share the community's pain. So when Moshe Rabbeinu stood at the top of the mountain as Bnei Israel were fighting, they say his hands grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him. The Talmud asked, the Gemara asked, did Moshe not have a cushion? Nobody could give him a pillow to sit on? No, Moshe said, if Israel is suffering, if Bnei Israel are suffering, I have to be with them in their pain as well. It would take more than the half hour we have to look at all of the Torah perspectives on empathy. Being a psychologist, I'm going to switch gear now, and I'm going to talk about the psychological perspectives. We developed neurological evidence of empathy decades ago when studies of nerve cells in macaw monkeys revealed the following. Scientists found that when monkeys either ate a banana or threw a ball, a specific set of nerve cells were engaged. They fired. What was even more intriguing was that they found that the same cells fired when monkeys did not throw a ball or eat a banana, but they simply watched others throwing a ball or eating a banana. When monkey 1 tosses a ball, monkey 2's brain lights up its ball-tossing center. Monkey 1 eats a banana. Monkey 2, banana-eating center of the brain lights up. Scientists initially called these cells monkey see, monkey do cells. Later, the name was changed to mirror neurons because the cells allow monkeys to mirror another being's action in their own mind. In 2007, Ramachandran, a pioneer in mirror neuron research, said he calls them empathy neurons or Dalai Lama neurons, for they are dissolving the barrier between the self and others. Now, research has continued to explore what happens biologically when we engage in empathic behavior. One neuroscientist, Barbara Fredrickson, has found that we experience decelerated heart rate, secretion of a bonding hormone, this will become important in a moment, called oxytocin, and regions of the brain that are associated with caregiving light up. Additionally, when we become interested in advocating for another's well-being, the parts of our brain that indicate reward and intrinsic reward and pleasure light up. So empathy might actually be good for us. Now, I said more to come on oxytocin, a wonderful study of the phenomena that happens when oxytocin is released. And here's how it goes. 2 groups watched videos of a father and a 4-year-old son. The 4-year-old son is, Lo Aleinu, we should know from it, is bald from chemo treatment for terminal brain cancer. There are 2 versions of this video. Half of the people watch what's called the emotional video, which has the father talking about his fears of losing his son, knowing that he's going to die. The neutral video features the father talking about a recent trip with his son to the zoo. The experimenters drew the blood of people who were watching this video, both sets, the neutral and the emotional, before and after. And they found that those people who watched the emotional video had a 157% increase in their oxytocin levels after watching the video. Those who watched the neutral video actually had a decrease in their oxytocin levels. Why does this matter? Because it turns out that oxytocin is related to empathy and increased generosity. those very same people who had that increased oxytocin level were much more empathic to the father's plight in surveys and in questionnaires. And as people left the study, they were asked if they would like to make a donation to a childhood cancer foundation. Guess who made the largest donations? Not surprisingly, those who'd seen the emotional video and those participants who experienced that huge bump in their oxytocin levels. So empathy does something to us. It changes us, both neurologically, and then it changes our behavior. But are there times and situations in which we're more likely to act empathically, and times when we are less likely to act empathically? What are the factors that might impact when we are able to follow our Torah prerogative, our Torah imperative, and recognize the ger in everybody and recognize the impoverished? And are there factors that we have to learn to fight against? So one of the factors is sameness. We are much more likely to feel empathy if we've experienced the same. It's why if we go back to those psukim in Shemot, that it goes from gerim hayitem, it goes from you were the stranger, but then it moves on and says the widowed and the orphaned and the impoverished and your neighbor. Even if you aren't widowed or orphaned, even if you aren't impoverished, you are mandated to feel it. And the Torah understands we're going to start with gerim because we were strangers. We get that. It's going to be harder for us when we are not the same as the people we need to feel empathy for. Paul Bloom wrote a very controversial book called Against Empathy. Interestingly, although he argued that empathy, because it's so specific, because we're more empathic with same people like us and less likely to help the broader population, that empathy might be a bad thing. When his own family member was ill, he did not argue against empathy for her well-being. But he states very clearly that empathy is biased. We are more prone to feel empathy for attractive people. We're more prone to feel empathy for those who look like us, who share our ethnic or national background. And empathy is narrow. It connects us to particular individuals, real or imagined, but it's insensitive to numerical differences and statistical data. As Mother Teresa put it, if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. Laboratory studies find over and over again that we really do care more about the one than about the many. I'll share some of that research in a moment. So long as we have personal information about the one. It is why charity drives and the public service announcements we see tell us stories of individuals, of real people, in order to pull at our empathy heartstrings and open our purse strings as well. Are we wired to actually distrust or to feel distant from the other? Well, Frans de Waal, who is a leading primatologist who studies primates, monkeys, says we've evolved to hate our enemies, to ignore people we barely know, and to distrust anyone who doesn't look like us. Even if we're largely cooperative within our communities, we become almost a different animal in our treatment of strangers. And once again, Paul Bloom says, some degree of emotional empathy is bred in the bone. The sight and sound of another's suffering is unpleasant for babies. Research on babies says as soon as they can move, they're going to try to help, patting and soothing others in distress. And this is not uniquely human. He again quotes de Waal, who notes that chimps will often put their arms around the victim of an attack and pat or groom her. So although we're wired to distrust, we're also wired with some basic feelings of compassion and care for the other. Another factor that plays in how empathic we will be or how easy it is whether or not the victim is identifiable to us. You know, as our country, as the United States reels in the aftermath of racially motivated deaths or of racially skewed numbers of deaths in the hands of police officers, you see that every victim, we have heard their story over and over again, because everybody understands that if these victims are faceless and nameless, that it will not encourage our empathy. Thomas Schelling, the economist, wrote, "Let a 6-year-old girl with brown hair need thousands of dollars for an operation that will prolong her life until Xmas, and the post office will be swamped with nickels and dimes to save her. Let it be reported that without a sales tax, the hospital facilities of all of Massachusetts will deteriorate and cause a barely perceptible increase in preventable deaths. Not many will drop a tear or reach into their checkbooks." Kogut and Ritov, two psychologists studying this phenomena, I asked, how much money would you give to develop a drug that would save one child versus how much money would you give to develop a drug that would save 8 children? The answers were actually about the same. 8 and 1, it didn't really make a difference. But in a third group, the experimenters told the participants the name and the age of the child. They showed her picture, and then it made a difference. The donations showed up. Many more wanted to give to help one, a known one, a visible one with a name and a face and identity, than to help 8 children who were any children. They could be anyone. So before we run out of time, we've looked at whether we, from a Torah perspective, should feel others' pain, and the answer is yes. We've looked at, from a psychological perspective, are there factors that make it easier or harder? Can we feel another's pain? And we find that, on the one hand, we're wired to distrust difference. On the other hand, we're wired for compassion. And we can, and we should feel others' pain. And there actually are a number of researchers who are looking at exactly how do we build on this natural inclination. The time does not allow me to go into all of these studies, but suffice it to say, from rats to humans, compassion and empathy can be learned, and it can be developed. Not only that, but it can feel intrinsically rewarding. It can make a difference. And those chemicals that are being released in our brain when we're giving, when we're compassionate, when we're empathic, those are the same chemicals that have to do with pleasure. So they are good for us. We can cultivate it, by the way, with very minor interventions. This is a series of studies, a number of studies, that found that as little as 7 minutes were enough to increase feelings of closeness and connection, which we know from the prior slides are important in building empathy. 9-week-long programs in loving kindness meditation found increased daily positive emotions, reduced depression, increased life satisfaction. The pro-social game, which measures one's pro-social behavior, empathy towards others multiple times in a game, found that you can increase it with very little amount of meditation practice, and it almost doesn't matter which type of meditation you do. And 8-week meditation trainings by Condon and his colleagues found that participants were able to act more compassionately toward a person who's suffering, giving up their chair to someone in crutches. And again, the type of meditation they did didn't matter. Just taking time out from our busy days, spending time in contemplation and in thought opens us up to seeing the world through others' eyes. There is no question that this is in our Torah DNA, that this is our Torah imperative, that not only can we, and not only should we, but we must, not just because of who we are as Jews individually, but because of who we need to be as Jews in our communities. And what a beautiful tie-in to Vayichan and our theme of Achdut. These 2 quotes, I think, are just the perfect indication of our, not only our Torah imperative, but what our Torah view allows us to become as a light unto the nations. David Breifman, the Chief Innovation Officer at New York's Jewish Education Project, writes that empathy is uncomfortable, it's difficult, it's challenging, but it's a skill that can be learned and developed. And embracing empathy as the new imperative, challenging ourselves to view things from a new perspective, makes us not only better people, but also better, more effective professionals living and working in a more vibrant and dynamic community. And although he wrote that to Jewish education professionals, it really is a message for all of us in the Jewish communal world and all of us who are part of the Jewish community. And Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks reminds us that in general, if you seek to change anyone's behavior, you have to enter into their mindset, see the world through their eyes, and try to feel what they are feeling, and then say the word or do the deed that speaks to their emotions, not yours. It's not easy. Very few people do this. Those who do change the world. We have within each one of us the opportunity to make other people's lives better from our understanding, from our ability to empathically take their perspective and walk in their shoes. And we have the ability, as we sit ready for Tisha B'Av and daven b'mheira b'yameinu for a refuah for Klal Yisrael, for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, for a reunification of the Jewish people and a healing of the world. We have the opportunity to feel others' pains, to do something about it, to open our minds and our hearts in new ways. Thank you. I've left contact information here for me, as well as my website, where you can see other materials and other programs.